So I've been nervous about this panel, but then Larry and Darren were arguing backstage, and I thought as long as I just get out of the way, then this will actually be pretty interesting. So let me give you a little bit of background and hopefully ask a couple of questions that sort of provoke a response, and then I'll get out of the way. So Darren Boulding is the CTO of Cambridge Analytica. It's a company that we'll talk about what they do, but sort of is micro-targeting of people based on who they are, what their interests are. Before that, he was the CTO of the RNC, the Republican National Committee, and he did that through 2016 and worked closely with the digital team for now president, then candidate Trump, which makes you at some level a Cloudflare customer because the Trump campaign used us.
Absolutely.
Along with, I think, 17 of the 18 major presidential candidates, including the other person who is joining me on stage, Professor Larry Lessig. Larry is a Harvard Law School professor, New York Times bestselling author, and former presidential candidate, also Cloudflare customer. So thank you for being. This is sort of the customer day, I guess, the customer panel. So Darren, if there's one person, we said that there's one person responsible for the Trump presidency. Mm-hmm. Seems like there's a kind of compelling argument that that might be you.
I would very much disagree with that. I think the person would be Donald Trump.
Well, but Donald Trump
more
aside.
so than other presidents in the past or candidates.
I think that's fair. Can you tell me a little bit about how Cambridge Analytica works? Sure. And how the Trump campaign used that to win the election?
Sure. I mean, so Cambridge Analytica does primarily data science and a full-service ad agency, if you want to put it in the simplest set of boxes, right? So data science is taking all the information that we know about different people who are already out there from all the different public sources that we found and other data brokers that we buy data from, as well as our own individual research that we performed. And we take that and we match that up with who if you're a customer, you give us your customer list, or if you're a company. In the case of a campaign, we match that up with lists of voters and things like that. And then we combine that data science with all the polling that we do and research we do to come up with ideas about who you might want to target to perhaps sell a product to, or in the sense of politics, this is who is a likely supporter of this candidate, this is their propensity to vote. Here are, in the case of the Trump campaign, there was 15 issue models that we made so that we had an idea of what issues were most interesting to people, whether they were likely to vote, and which candidate they might support. And then in addition to that, we do all of the digital advertising component. So using all of the different typical digital tools that are out there, as well as some atypical ones. And by combining the data element with the digital advertising, that gives us a lot of power. And we also have been doing TV.
You don't want to take credit for having won the election, but no. It's fair to say that the campaign's use of data and targeting was a factor in the election.
Absolutely.
And an important factor.
Yeah, and I think beyond just what Cambridge did, what the RNC did, starting in 2013 after the debacle that we had in 2012, is one of those great turnaround stories that a small group of people came in and said, let's take something that's basically technologically not so good, all the way through in 3 years to being the market leader, if you would say.
So Larry, you ran a presidential campaign really focused on one issue, which was campaign finance reform. And yet, in this presidential election, the candidate that spent less, raised from smaller contributors, spent half as much as Hillary Clinton, ended up being the winner. Is campaign finance the key issue still, or do we have to start worrying about data as the new sort of divider between who wins and who loses elections?
Well, so my slogan was not fix campaign finance. In fact, those words I hate because they make people's eyes glaze over. Mine was fix democracy first. And what that meant was all the different ways in which this system denies us a democracy, in the sense that we are equal citizens. So you might say the way campaigns fund themselves, if you've got a Congress that's spending 30 to 70% of their time raising money from 60,000 Americans, that's not a Congress that's concerned much with how to represent ordinary Americans. If you have a system of gerrymandering where 89 million Americans live in districts where they know their congressman doesn't give a shit about them because they couldn't ever matter to that congressman's elections, that's not a system of representing Americans equally. And when you've got techniques for making it harder for people to vote based on what their party is, that's not a system that produces rabid citizenship driving to electing a president. And that's what I was talking about even before we get to the fact that we have an electoral college that basically means that the vote of Republicans here in California is worth nothing in the calculation of who our president is going to be. These are all ways in which we have a failed democracy. And what I wanted to do was to at least get to the chance to be in the debate on the Democratic stage, to be able to say, let's finally, as a party, rally around fixing this fundamentally flawed, corrupted democracy. Now, what happened is the Democratic Party, just at the moment that I qualified to be on that stage, changed the rules so that I couldn't be on the debate stage.
Well, we're happy to have you here on this
yeah,
stage.
well,
so.
you didn't change the rules. But I would suggest that the man who won took the very same set of slogans, drain the swamp, this is a deeply corrupted government, it's all about the horrible people in Washington who don't care to represent you, and ran as full force as he could, and targeted as his opponent a woman who he characterized, I think it wasn't a fair characterization, but a woman who he characterized was just sold out to these interests precisely. So no, I don't think this is a wrong issue. I think it is the fundamental issue, and we've got to figure out a way to rally a political system to finally deal with it, and that's the challenge.
I mean, one of the core tenets of democracy seems like there's a shared understanding. And it seems to me like if you've got 15 different targeted messages, many of which didn't even mention Trump, does that corrode the shared understanding?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Darren and I were talking before we came on stage, and he was trying to figure out if we really disagreed about anything, and he wanted to know what the secret, lines I was going to use are. And the truth is, in the half of Darren's world that's focused on commerce and giving people what they want in commerce, it's the best of all possible times. In the half of the architecture of communication that's focused on giving people access to Netflix and a billion television channels, it's the best of all possible times. But as my friend Aaron Swartz said, we have to recognize the way in which the internet is the best of all possible times and the worst of all possible times at the same time. And so when you shift from the focus of the commerce or culture to democracy, realize that the very same technologies actually undermine the ability for us to do democracy the way we've done it before. I'm not saying we can't improve or find a new way to do it, but the way we used to do it doesn't work anymore. And this point you've made is exactly, I think, the way to see it. It used to be that the process of winning an election was the same as the process of building the coalition you needed to govern. It was all out in the front. It was all out in plain sight. And when you actually won, you knew what the coalition and the beliefs were that made it so you won, so you then had the chance to go and do something. When you have the technologies that I think Cambridge Analytica and others have begun to develop perfected, the project of winning an election is completely separate from the project of governing.
So Darren, Darren, are you destroying democracy?
No. In fact, and I would actually somewhat disagree that you need to have a complete shared context to have democracy. Democracy is either representative or direct democracy, right? So that's the act of democracy, is actually allowing people to choose who their representatives are or to affect the policy. That doesn't necessarily imply that everyone has to have the same shared context. It's probably helpful. It's good for society for us to have some of that shared context. But I think it's actually beneficial, I would argue, that people who have different points of view and people who have different interests and they have different subjects of things that they think are important, they should have those issues addressed. And respectfully, if you think that politicians have not been going around saying different things to different groups of people, they've been doing that since the beginning of politics.
But I mean, you work for a company that says they have a unique technology to be able to do that better.
Sure.
What is it like? Is there something? What is it about that technology that's so much uniquely better that it is, again, a great business?
Sure.
That then on this other side doesn't then give you something which corrodes that shared understanding?
Well, I don't think it. First off, the shared understanding is out there, as Larry and I were talking about, is almost more cultural than it is specific pieces of information or anything like that. And I think that having a conversation with you about the regulations that Germany might impose on there doesn't prevent you from knowing about other aspects of foreign policy with Germany. It's just a specific thing you might really care about. So why wouldn't it be better for democracy for you to be able to engage with a candidate or have a candidate tell you their opinions about something that's specific to what what you're interested in? Now, if they start telling you one thing and they start telling someone else a contradictory thing, I think that's a really big problem, and it's also something that in our current system it would be very quickly found out, and I would hope would have some form of moral hazard to the candidate that were to do so. But as long as they are maintaining consistent points of view, I don't think it is actually a bad thing for people to communicate about the issues that are more important to a specific person.
Yeah, well, so I wouldn't say that Cambridge Analytica produced this highly diffuse culture where people don't have any shared understanding of the basic facts. You didn't produce that. You have nothing to do with that. Mm-hmm. That's a product of the infrastructure for communication that has evolved since the 1960s and 1970s. And what we don't really recognize enough is how extraordinary the period of the 1960s and 1970s were for democracy. Because in the 1960s, 1970s, everybody was focused on 3 television shows every night on the news. And those 3 television shows were right down the middle, and they told the public the news. And as data scientists like Marcus Pryor at Princeton have shown, America basically understood the same stuff from these.
So, like Julius Janikowski, former chair of the FCC, says, maybe this is the natural state that we're in today.
Right.
And that what was happening then is you had 3 companies that controlled such a profitable technology that the thing that they were most afraid of was regulation. And so they spent all this time being neutral and straight down the middle and elevating the conversation. You go back to the early elections in this country, and people are arguing about who's sleeping with their servants, and I mean, all just craziness.
Yeah.
Like, is that just is the 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s maybe? Is that what we should be striving for, or is that just sort of an unnatural reaction to fear of regulation and technology development?
I completely agree. That was this extraordinary period in the history of humanity. And all that I'm saying is that, in a certain sense, defined how we understand what democracy is supposed to do. And that period is gone. I don't want to get back to it. I don't want to create the world where we're all watching 3 shows. I think those 3 shows were too narrow in a million ways. I would agree with you. It's a great thing that we have all sorts of different perspectives. But my point is, we don't yet have a good model for how to work a democracy where we all live in our own little worlds, these niche worlds of understandings of the basic facts. Because here's the big difference between where we are now and where we were before that weird period of the 1950s, 1960s. In some sense, the architecture of media today is just like the architecture of media in the 19th century. There were a million different sources. Nobody had the same. Most journalism was partisan journalism. It all looked like Fox News or MSNBC. It was all about how do you rally the troops to your own version of the truth, and it was all lies that they were telling everybody. So it was the way it was back then is the way it is in some sense now. The difference is we had no way to know what the public thought back then. In a certain sense, it's only what the politicians thought that mattered, because back then we didn't even have polling. we had no way to even recognize that the public didn't believe or even understand the facts because there was no way to get to that information.
I mean, the other thing is you had an understanding. You bought a particular tabloid. It had a political position, and you knew what you were getting. At some level, Facebook and the various platforms that are out there, Google, it's the algorithm. Come on, right? At some level there is something that's going on there that is an editorial voice, and you don't know what that is. That neutrality almost elevates its credibility in some way.
You mean today, or?
I think today.
Yeah.
Whereas back then, you pick up the conservative newspaper, you read it, and it says, vote conservative, and you think, yeah, they're going to say that because they're the conservative newspaper.
Right, and back then, in a certain sense, what that was doing was just driving people to vote in a certain way or not. And it didn't, in beyond voting for certain parties or not, drive public policy. But today, the views of people about whether we should go to war in Iraq or whether terrorists deserve to be, whether immigrants deserve to be, that's a terrible slip, I'm sorry, but whether immigrants deserve to be blocked as they try to enter the United States, the views of the people with respect to those questions today matter directly. You say we either have a representative democracy or a direct democracy.
Yeah.
We're supposed to have a representative democracy, but the way the evolution of polling and the understanding of the public has developed is that we have increasingly a direct democracy on top, and that direct democracy is informed by a public that doesn't know squat about many of these issues because we live in these niche market bubble worlds that don't actually inform us the way we did during this bizarrely weird period of the middle of the 20th century.
Data science is part of the solution to that. I mean, if I find that I'm in an echo chamber where I'm only getting certain points of view, then I can actually use a tool on Facebook to tell me what percentage of my Facebook feed is Democrat or Republican, and I can see that perhaps I need to improve the hygiene of what I consume from news.
So that's the argument that we as a society are just getting used to the technology. We will get better at being able to interpret these things and see through it. That's
part of it. I also think that these tools make it actually easier for smaller groups of people who have specific points of view to get those points of view out there into the zeitgeist of the market. Instead of needing a huge amount of money to go run an ad campaign across all the major newspapers in the United States, go raise $10,000, do a targeted influencer campaign to get your message in front of a few people so you can get it starting to be tweeted out or message go viral or something like that. And then your message starts getting out there and your topic is being discussed. You couldn't do that before because all of the power was in these small number of entrenched interests. So I think that data science, especially where it is so available through things like Facebook and other DMPs and things like that, where you can actually have just individual people make use of it. Now, if you've got the money to spend, come talk to us. We'll help you make it even that much better. But what's available to anybody is actually quite powerful, and it increases the diversity of thought. It increases the conversation that's occurring. And I appreciate the value of having a shared context, and I appreciate the value of having that you think that this particular president was elected with this mandate to do these things, and it would be great if we had more cohesive points of view in our both parties for the last few years if you're trying to get things done in Congress and things like that. But I, for one, think that if you are accurately representing what the populace is interested in, that is in no way a bad thing for democracy. If that's a good thing for democracy, and if the public is fractured in so many ways that you can't make a single decision, then that is what the public deserves. Because
you had Larry nodding his head, and then you kept talking, and now he's shaking it. So
good.
Yeah, I mean, I spent many, many years in the place you are. Well, first of all, as we were talking, when I was a kid, I was a Republican. I was the youngest member of the 1980 delegation to the Republican National Convention. Then I grew up, but I used to be.
That's usually the opposite direction.
Yeah,
you go, right?
Right. But the point is, for many years when I was celebrating the internet, I was saying exactly the stuff you were saying, right? And I think that, what we were talking about was how amazing it was going to be to have this technology where anybody could speak. And I think what we didn't think enough about was the way it would also change the culture, the context within which this speech could happen. And nobody kind of began to reckon what it would look like when that context was changed. So here's one thing that has never happened in the history of humanity. The ability of somebody to speak to 30 million people directly without an editor standing between. That's just never happened in the history of humanity. Every time, in the 20th century when we had broadcasting, there was always somebody who said, no, your view's too crazy. We're not going to allow you on to say what you're saying. And if you wanted to get a New York Times, you had to pass through the New York Times board. Like, there was always this level of editors. But we're now in a place where a guy can tweet, and that tweet is seen by 30 million people, or actually 3, because nobody reads tweet streams anymore. But anyway, the theory is you're speaking directly to the... And we don't yet know how to run a democracy with that dynamic. Now, there is a way in which I think we learn. When I was a kid, I hitchhiked through the Soviet Union, and I was on a train with I was always followed by a guy who happened to speak English. So here was my version on this train when I was going to St. Petersburg or Leningrad, and he said to me, in the Soviet Union, we have a better system of free speech than you do in America. And I said, what the hell could you possibly mean by that? And he said, well, you wake up in America and you read the New York Times or the Wall Street Journal, and you think you know the truth. But we wake up and we realize every newspaper is lying to us. So we have to read 7 different newspapers before we can figure out what the truth is. And that develops a better culture, critical understanding than you have in the United States. And as I look at the internet today, and I look at like my parents on the internet and my kids on the internet, I begin to think like we have become the Soviet Union. Our parents don't yet know how to deal with a world where everybody is telling, is lying to you. But our kids increasingly do. They increasingly know how to listen and to triangulate and try to figure out what must be going on based on 7 or 8 different feeds. So that's a hopeful story.
So the solution is time?
It in part is time.
If you believe there's a problem, the solution is that over time that we'll get there. Maybe the question is, if Cambridge Analytica won this election, and everyone always makes them, and the Clinton campaign was following sort of the Obama model, what's going to be the thing? What's the next trick? Like, who's going to win the next election? What's going to be what's the story coming out of that?
I think that, well, this is me pontificating. You asked me to, right? So I think personalization of information where you allow individuals to better communicate with the people they know. I think that is the next big innovation that's going to happen. So what that means is that rather than a person talking to 30 million people, which I would also just William Randolph Hearst would probably disagree with you that he was edited when he decided to put out an editorial in one of his papers. But if rather than having one person,
but the president, I mean,
it wasn't anywhere close to 30 million people when Hearst spoke.
Fair enough. It was proportionate, I would think.
No, not even proportional.
You don't think that?
No.
Well, all right. In this case, rather than having one person broadcasting to a huge number of people, you'll have that personal relationship that when I talk to people, I will know who I should be talking to that is most interested in the topics that I want to talk to them about. And so it's the dispersion of the central control over the message out to individuals so that they're all acting on behalf of the campaign or the cause, whatever it may be. I think that's really powerful because now instead of just Donald Trump talking at you, it's this person coming and talking to you that you already have a relationship with.
It's a way to trick the kids, right?
Yeah,
If your friends are telling you something, I mean that's how do you take the cynics and get them?
You might call it grassroots organizing as well, or community organizing.
It's certainly great. It's certainly a wonderful development. But the problem, the thing that I don't think we know how to deal with yet is if they're doing that on the basis of a completely disparate understanding of the world. So some people think the world is up and the other people think the world's down. Some people think climate change is real, other people think climate change is false. If there's no common set of understandings that they're playing this game on top of, then again, it might be good for winning elections, but it's not going to be good for building the democracy we need to actually govern once we've won those elections.
I would say you're arguing about the the top level at the Congress and the president and things like that. I think you're building a community in each town. You're building, it can be a virtual community as well across, but you're actually building a sense of community that these are the people I can talk with, and I talk to them about these issues because this is where they're interested in. I would like to talk to them about abortion because that's an issue that's important to them. I'd like to talk to them about school choice because that's what's important to them. Or about climate change because that's what's important.
I want to open it up to questions. So if you have a question, raise your hand. We'll get you a mic. We were just talking with a partner of ours in China, and this really smart young engineer said, the problem, democracy seems great, but the problem with it is it always drops to lowest common denominator. And it kind of hurt to hear that. And does that, is that the core, is that, how do we fix that if that's the case?
You pass that to me. That's nice.
No, I'll answer that first.
You've got to fix that problem.
No, I mean, democracy itself, if you look at pure democracy, that's part of the reason why we move towards representative democracy. And that's why people would always vote themselves more benefits without any idea of the future consequence of that. And that's not just this guy in China that's figured that out. That was our original founders were wrestling with that idea. And I think, we just have to keep trying. I think that's where it boils down to. That's maybe not be a great answer, but I would defer to the founders.
There.
Hi. Does Cambridge Analytica and its tools make problems like Willie Horton better or worse kind of going forward?
You want me to take that?
It was for you.
I wasn't sure if he was asking about that. I don't think it really actually plays that much of a role one way or another. Your context is the Willie Horton ads that occurred in the Bush campaign back.
My
Yeah.
context is using the lowest common denominator that Prince was talking about to push elections one way or the other based on things that aren't factual and might actually be destructive to some folks that look like Willie.
I don't think it makes it any better or worse. I think it just makes the message, whether it is positive or negative, more amplified.
Yeah, so then here we have a real disagreement because, yes, it makes it much worse. The reason it makes it much worse is that you had an assumption in your early introduction that just is not there, which is that people can't be inconsistent in how they're representing themselves in this world. But if you've got perfect micro-targeting and no attention span by the media to what anybody is saying, then you can represent 74 different positions on any particular issue that you need to represent in order to grab these different people into the mix. And so that was my sense, that was my whole point of, if we have this technology that perfects the ability to elect people by pulling people in 1,000 ways, but not through a public conversation that produces the dynamic of governance, I think that encourages this dynamic, doesn't stifle it.
I would just say that as long as the candidate or whatever message is consistent and doesn't change its point of view when it talks to one
When
group
have
than
you
another.
ever seen that in modern politics? These people are inconsistent all
They may
the
be
time.
inconsistent in their views generally speaking, but they are not intentionally saying X to some person and not X to another person.
Wow.
Yeah, with the mic.
My name is Tom Adkins. I've done work on the Democratic side with micro-targeting, and I'm blown away by the, consistently by the power that it has and the efficacy it has. And this is a real question. It's not an attack, but honestly, where do you draw the line, Darren, on ethical micro-targeting? I mean, because your company has been associated with some of these divisive racial messages that helped Donald Trump win the election. Are you creating models that find, the people to be most influenced by these divisive racial messages so that other people, other consultants working for the Trump campaign or their allies can better target them? Like, political consultants left and right have come together to ban things in the past, like push polling. If you do a push poll, you are ostracized from the pollster community, Dems and Republicans. Can't we do the same on some of these absurd racial messages that are now, for the first time, getting attention because of the campaign you were associated with?
So I don't think Cambridge actually pushed any racially charged messages that you're talking about, and
Do you identify people who, do you have a category that is racists? Like, and
No,
he, and
no.
he,
That was actually one of the
I
points
mean,
that I would actually was going to make is that there was no. We had 15 models, and if you know, we would have found a code word for it to call it something else. But if we thought that it was meaningful to talk about it, we would have at least talked about the subject of doing it, and it never even came up.
Don't you think someone like, even if you guys have that, how do we set a set of rules or a framework or a social contract so that, I don't know, Oxford Analytica doesn't create, you know, the racist profile?
Well, I mean, you'll read a story today that broke today about ProPublica and Facebook, where ProPublica discovered that Facebook essentially had an anti-Jew advertising category, basically people who hate Jews. And they paid to advertise to those people who hate Jews. And these categories had been developed through algorithms inside of Facebook that just determined these are people and these are their wants. And the point is, this is exactly the kind of the best of times and worst of times that I'm talking about. It's not that Mark Zuckerberg is animated by the idea of attacking Jews. It's that his technology is interested in just finding what people want and serving it. And in 99% of what we care about, the market and in culture, that's a great thing. That's what we want. We want diversity. We want people to get what they want. But in certain spaces, like the democracy space, it's a terrifying thing when what this can do is enable the feeding of really the type of conversation that destroys the capacity for democracy.
If you found yourself nodding at the ACLU, at Lee and Daphne's panel a second ago, and you find yourself nodding now, just notice how the real tension exists between both of those things. One.
The world that you're describing with all these fractured communities forming these vast echo chambers happen to be riding on these social networks that are measured, whose top metrics are the kind of engagement that they can produce. That means a whole bunch of incendiary things will pretend to outperform things that are much more measured and reasonable. Not only is this already bad because it helps some messages get carried forward, but it also is going to be, and already is in my argument, driving behavior. People make decisions based on the information and knowledge they consume. The moment that specific algorithms or groups or echo chambers completely control their entire sources of information, and they can be explicitly targeted, we're now talking about driving mass behavior. And that's completely at a different level than just giving people what they want.
And so your question is?
The question is, like, what I'm driving towards is, how can data science be used responsibly? And what kind of regulation do we need to look at? Because what is happening in social networks and the whole host of consultants on top of these social networks is straight up driving behavior. And right now, I don't think we're even close to seeing how bad it can get.
So your question is, what regulations should we have on data science in particular?
How do we fix that? Is it regulation that's needed? And if so, what kind of regulation? And if not, what other kinds of structures can we talk about?
I think that's a good question. And I think if you look at the European Union, you know, they have the GPDR and things like that, where they're trying to institute controls over how much data is available. And I think to some degree, people being more aware of what information that they are giving up is going to be actually helpful. I realize that's somewhat effects removed from the overall problem you're talking about, but it's if you know what information you're giving up, then you know what you're able to be targeted on. So that is one controlling pushback on the behavior that you're describing. I think there also probably will need to be developing some sort of code of ethics about what is right and what is wrong to do with data. It's a tool. If you use that tool for evil, then you're going to make evil more efficient. If you use it as a tool for good, then you're going to make good more efficient. And so just like all new industries, there's going to need to be some level of ethics that are put in there. I am, inherently, generally not a fan of regulation of things, and I think that it generally, what will happen if you do regulation is that entrenched players will be able to conform with that regulation, and you'll eventually get regulatory capture, where only the people who are large incumbents will actually be able to perform in it, and that will stifle innovation. But there should be some element of some sort of ethical behavior that you need there, and it is things like algorithms will find the worst in us, if you let them go nuts. If we had just let unsupervised training occur across the models, we might have found some things that we would really be uncomfortable finding or being able to market to. And if you think this is all on one side, I think you're fooling yourself about, it's not all people on one side of the spectrum. There are people who are marketing to similar evil angels on the other side of the political divide as well.
Yeah, but it's fun and hopeful to talk about codes of ethics stifling the worst here. But if the worst is profitable, the code of ethics will be eaten by the profitable. And so I think we need to recognize we're in a place where the natural drive of the market is producing a world we've never yet learned how to manage. Now, maybe we will, but I see certain kinds of problems, and I just wonder, are we capable of dealing with it? So, for example, there's an amazing quote at the end of one of Steve Bannon's last interviews before he was fired from the White House, where he said, "What we want is the Democrats to talk about identity politics and race every single day between now and the election, and we're going to talk about economic nationalism, and we're going to kill them." And you begin to realize that the racism stuff is just them playing the Democrats. It's just a game. It's like if we say outrageous things, all the Democrats are going to talk only about race, and they can't help but talk about race because you're not going to be a progressive Democrat and not take up the issue. So it's like they just play, and we don't have the attention span or the discipline to actually resist it, and that leads us to a place where we cannot begin to talk about the sort of issues that we need to talk about to win as a party. And I'm not sure in the world of 2-second attention spans or this kind of fragmented structure of media, what you do to resist that. I mean, I'm hopeful my kids will teach me what that is, but right now, it's pretty bleak to think about what the technology or the technique of resisting that is going to be.
We didn't end with this panel because I had a feeling that the answer was going to be it's pretty bleak. So, so we got one more. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.